Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, folks. How you doing? It's Danny Tisdale, and you, of course, are listening to the Danny Tisdale Show, where we talk about everything, all things that are Harlem, and almost, I think, possibly the best things that happen in and around Harlem, at least what I think. And I think after you listen to this podcast, you'll feel the same way. I hope you're doing well today. And hopefully after you listen to this podcast, you're feeling even better. We're calling and you are listening to Harlem World Radio. And we're going to have a nice podcast today. And as we usually do, and talk about some of the things that are happening on the education side of Harlem. You can check us out or hit us up with questions at twitter.com/HWMag. The same on Facebook, facebook.com/HWMag, and also at Harlem World Magazine hashtag if you have any questions, want to say anything, or follow up on this podcast that we're about to do. Also, don't forget to hit us up on the behemoth on the website at harlemworldmag.com, harlemworldmag.com. And without further ado, I want to get right into our conversation with a friend of mine, Mike McQuillan. He's a former U.S. Senate aide and a Peace Corps volunteer. He served on the NYPD Training Advisory Council. He teaches history and mathematics at Expeditionary Learning School for community leaders in Brooklyn. In addition, he is the author of an article posted on the website this past week that got tons of hits, and it's an op-ed titled "What Makes Social Protests Effective? A unique school sends teens citywide seeking answers." Last but not least, he's also a dad, a husband, father of two. Hey, how's it going, Mike?
Hey, Danny. Really good to be with you.
And vice versa. We worked together in the past in a education setting, and what I love is that we've remained connected. I wish we were working together, but the next best thing is to talk about the work that you're doing, and I want to give you your props for that and for sharing the What Makes Social Protests Effective article. We've had great response to it. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that you and Harlem World Magazine and your many listeners and readers support my raising through my voice, the voice of young people like those described in the article, who had a memorable chance to access prominent people who have the power to make some of the social changes that they and we believe we all need.
Yeah, and Mike, you know, it's I give you your props in a lot of different ways because you're kind of a modest guy, but you do great work, and for some reason I'm drawn to people like that. And so what, or should I say, who has inspired you to do the kind of work you do in your approach in the classroom?
Well, I think we have to go back farther because we're influenced in childhood by the kind of men or the kind of people we want to be when we grow up. And so when I was in 5th grade, after I outgrew my cowboy fascination with Hopalong Cassidy and Roy Rogers, JFK was my hero. My dad took me when I was 7 years old, late in the 1960 campaign, to sit on his shoulders, my dad's shoulders, at a late-stage JFK nighttime rally, and though word kept rippling through the crowd in the rain and in the dark of night that the candidate was running late, his plane was just leaving Boston, and I knew it was going to be way too far past my bedtime for me to see him in the flesh. The experience was so memorable, it leaves a painted picture in my memory at this moment. And later, Kennedy's saying that a man does what he must, I think, taught me that sometimes one needs to sail against the wind without taking reckless or undue risk, but for the sake of what one identifies as moral principle. And obviously, on a micro level, as a 7-year-old, I probably defined that in terms of cookies or getting to watch an extra cartoon show or something. But as we grow into adulthood and we experience the idea that the environment in which we're privileged to grow is often very different from the environment that's normal for most people, our ideas of moral justice and therefore our own moral integrity get refined and get sharpened. And so when Kennedy grew in his last year, particularly to call for coexistence with the Soviet Union rather than Cold War,
right.
that also taught me that one can be secure enough in one's own personhood that one can learn new things and change one's perspective and have the guts to express that in public and try to act to make it real. And that stayed with me as I've sought to learn to become first, hopefully, to be thought of as a good teacher, and then to define what it would mean to be a great teacher if one could do that. And then finally, if one could do that, or if one identified colleagues as having done that, to speculate on whether there was an even higher level that one might call exemplary, and if so, what would that look like on a day-to-day basis?
So, well, first let me say that had to be an incredible impression that was made with you at 7, and to you to recollect it in a very clear, concise way, the way that you do. And I know you. Thanks again for being here, because I know you're fighting the bug. So, good luck with that.
Yeah, thanks.
So, it also made me think, here you're mentioning Kennedy, and then we've had the president release more files regarding that. Hopefully it's not too far away, and I'll circle back either way, but
You always do. And we know everything connects, don't we, Danny?
That's right. Exactly. Any response to those files being released and the Kennedy story by way of President Trump?
Yeah, I mean, teaching history, one learns that the real object is to seek truth and to have classified materials declassified these 50-some years after the awful tragedy.
Amazing.
Certainly intrigues and interests me, particularly in light of the idea that perhaps there's a conceivable philosophical and political connection between the allegations and the likelihood of collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign and the present, and Cold War collusion by Russia in Kennedy's demise on the other. So I, like many Americans, am eager to have the time and space to actually look up the documents and go through them at whatever pace I can. However, having said that, I also want to make clear my commitment to the idea of celebrating Kennedy's life, not as the legend he's become or the marketing symbol he's been made out to be, not to be larger than in death than he was in life, but rather to see him as a man, as I do, who came from a privileged background, was thus understandably late to embrace civil rights with a degree of emotional commitment, as he finally became able to do again in 1963, a real crucible year for him after the assassination of Medgar Evers and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, but somebody who thus evolved in his outlook and then felt morally compelled to try to use the levers of power to engender a process of positive change. And I think had he lived, we would view Kennedy today as much differently, and I think the course of the country's subsequent direction would have been altered constructively. So that's where I prefer to put my focus, not to lament what has not been, but to ask myself when I look in the mirror, what can I do as one small, though strong human being to try to throw a pebble in the water and set forth some ripples to move us a little more toward doing good for each other rather than doing injustice for each other.
Well, Mike, you sound exactly like the words you used in trying to be a great teacher, great educator, because you brought what could sound like a negative into a positive, and I always love that. And you mentioned great teacher, and I just, for the listeners out there, I always send guests questions of what I might ask, and I always say that there'll be starter questions, and I think we've been on for about 10 minutes, and I've only gotten to one of the questions that I said I was going to ask you, because I keep coming up with other questions that I want to ask you. You mentioned earlier a great teacher, wanting to be a great teacher. I'm paraphrasing some of this. What does make a great teacher?
I think in history there are two bottom line ideas that seem clear to me after struggling with finding an answer to that question for the past 18 years of teaching. First is I've come to see the idea that history comes alive when we frame it as stories of people who've struggled for positive changes in society, because that inevitably forces us to sketch or encourages us to sketch the setting, the time period, the other players in the drama, the moral dilemma they face, meaning there may be more than one right answer depending on one's perspective for the particular situation we look at, and then to try to identify what one might believe is the way to work for justice without doing injustice to one's adversaries or opponents. There's a wonderful essay about the basic idea of seeing history as stories by Professor Gordon Chang, a history professor at Stanford University, who reports that he was angered by the way he was taught history in high school, particularly remembering, as he does, an assignment where he had to memorize in order the names of all the presidents of the United States to that time. And I don't know the year, but the fact that we don't know the year tells us the story is important, because it's as memorable to Professor Chang today as it was when he was a young man in high school. And too often, with the overemphasis of recent years and perhaps a recent decade on standardized testing for its own sake, rather than interpreting in a flesh and blood way what are the strengths and needs of an individual student to help him or her grow into his or her full meant personhood. Too often there's memorization of fact without context. And I think that's contrary to what good or great teaching in history must be. All the other of the 2 points I mentioned is the idea of relating in a human way. Too often teachers, with the demands of completing a defined lesson plan in a 45-minute period, are forced to forego the sort of human relating one-to-one with individual students that would acquaint them with the best of each other and therefore establish a firmer foundation of trust with which to become able over time to do higher level academic work. And I'm thankful that in the school where I work, Leaders High School in Brooklyn's Lafayette building, most of our classes are co-taught, and thereby when one person may be leading the full class or working with a certain segment of the students, the other one can do more detective work, trying to draw out the quiet, address the distressed, encourage the advanced, students, and so on. And, as Reverend Daniel Berrigan said once, apart from his legendary 1960s civil disobedience protests, he was once asked, what do you think you have to show for all of your so-called noble efforts? And he said, it doesn't matter what I or anybody else thinks there is to show for it. What matters is it's good to do good because it's good to do good. And I think that's what really needs to be emphasized in contemporary teaching, particularly in a time where the one consensus we have in this country is that we don't have a consensus, and on the contrary, seem to be more bitterly divided than perhaps since the Civil War.
Well, I love that, and I wanted to, kind of transition a bit, because just about every educator I know really works pretty hard to be the best that they can be. And I don't think educators, teachers get enough props for the work that they do that's above and beyond what the job description asks. But, we're at that halfway point that I mentioned to you, Mike. And before I go into a quick little break here, I wanted to ask you, the name of the project is What Makes Social Protest Effective.
Yeah.
So that's the question that I have for you is what makes social protests effective? And I ask you that before I go into our station ID, letting our listeners know that they're listening to Danny Tisdale on the Danny Tisdale Show. It's part of Harlem World Radio, and I'm glad that you're listening with us today, taking this time out of your day to listen to our conversation with educator Mike McQuillan. And you can check us out at Facebook at facebook.com/HWMag, also on Twitter at twitter.com/HWMag, and also on HarlemWorldMag.com. Now we're back with Mike, and Mike, I was asking you about the project itself, which was titled What Makes Social Protests Effective. So I asked you, what makes social protests effective?
I think first to know what one is protesting and why one should protest. But I mean that in a way that transcends the gut reaction of anger or fear or sorrow or frustration, and rather say one must take the time to identify the issue and then carefully formulate a position based on an analysis of more than one source and more than one side of the controversy. That's one. Secondly,
that's important.
Secondly, what's the goal? What do we want? And is what we want representing an increase in justice without adding to someone else's injustice? In other words, do we have our moral integrity in this position, or have we made ourselves hypocrites? And then finally, to identify who are the prominent people with the power to make the changes that we believe are in order, and how can we protest in a way that does not make our emotion become a negative issue to be used against the cause we represent, but how do we raise our voices in a way that we can make those voices heard by those people in power, or by people high enough in the societal political totem pole to be able to interpret that message and relay it with some meaning to the people with the power to make changes. And you played a vital role in demonstrating that method by your artist-in-residence work with me, with John Martin, with Meredith Phillips, and the then senior students of the Academy of Urban Planning in Bushwick, where in the aftermath of the terrible shooting of Sean Bell on the eve of his wedding to Nicole Polt, at school, we knew there was a need for students to talk about what had happened and how it impacted them personally, given their racial and ethnic demographic, but also how you and I and Meredith and John decided, when we were told, well, maybe if we were lucky we could get a community affairs officer from the local precinct to come, we said no. The commissioner, Ray Kelly, at the time, is the one with the power to make changes on stop and frisk and use of force and racial profiling that we worked with the students to express and to itemize through your wonderful performance art, your illustrative art, and also the example of you as a strong individual with your racial identity who could relate in a strong, collaborative way with people like myself who are light-skinned and come from a much different political orientation, most likely, in terms of our upbringing. And that taught me that there's more than one way to express that voice, and that the student who may be quiet in classroom discussion may be, if unchained, a vibrant, brilliant artist in a way to reach an audience more effectively at times. So finally, I recall Reverend Al Sharpton in our first meeting during the week-long social protest intensity project, saying to students of himself, when asked what he had learned from his long career of working for social justice, he said, quote, "When I was a young man protesting, I let my emotions run away with me, and that got me into trouble and damaged the cause that I was trying to advance. Now that I'm older, I see the importance of reason and time, and the role of emotion in fueling a protest while the role of reason is the one that guides the protest toward fruition. And I think that's wonderful, wonderful advice for young would-be protesters, and I think also Sharpton's addition that one needs to be consistent is also well worth reflecting on. A student asked me when I first became aware of him, and I said that marching behind him and many others in Howard Beach in January 1987, after the December 86 racial killings, was a personal turning point in my life, whereupon that same student asked the Reverend, how do you find the energy and motivation to keep going doing this work after all you've done and all you've sacrificed? And he said that he was impressed by watching Dr. King preach when Sharpton was a boy, and impressed and learned from joining his organization, and ultimately he decided that his mission would be the people, and he would be consistent in that through whatever lifetime awaited him.
Yeah, and that was a really great point that you made, and I love the fact that you kind of helped me do my work for me, because I wanted to circle back to the story that you posted on the site, and Reverend Sharpton was a guest. Dr. Hazel Dukes, Dr. Tracy, is it Kesey?
Kesey is how it's pronounced.
Okay, Kissy, and some others from Leaders High School on the Lafayette campus. Is social protest for everyone, Mike, out in the street holding hands? Is that something that we all should do, or are there ways to have social protest and it's not necessarily in the street, it's not necessarily this, it's not necessarily that? Do we do it in our own special way, or we all should be out on the street holding hands and protesting?
Well, even if we should all be out in the streets, which I'm not convinced we should, we all would not be in the streets. That's never happened, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think my daughter, Katie, who's 26, is right when she says everyone needs to find his or her own platform. You're a teacher. I'm a writer. I think what matters is not how we do good individually, but that we do good that we can define as good towards some sort of common end with our fellow citizens toward making this country at last live up to the democratic ideals that have been so long promised.
Most certainly, and your daughter is right on, and it sounds like you've done a great job of raising the little one. And you have a son also, correct?
Yes, that's right, a junior.
Okay.
He is a junior now at Penn State, where he began as a sports journalist and is branching out to music and broader social concerns in his writing.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure I could speak to him because the Penn State football team is one of my faves. So, but I know we're not going to get into that. I just wanted to meeting. Right.
But I'm equally proud of both of them, as you can well imagine.
I could imagine. You and the wife done a great job. And of course, as I mentioned, we're at our last 5 minutes here, and I wanted to ask you. It sounds, and I know that you're doing intense work because there's intense things going on around the world, here in the United States, and of course in New York City. What suggestion do you have for someone who wanted to follow in your footsteps, Mike?
Well,
as an educator, agent of change.
I believe in conversation, so someone might drop me a line to my leader's email, which is mmcquillan@leaders6-12.org, and I would gladly respond. I believe that when two people converse about things that really matter together, they create a new insight or understanding that neither, including myself, could arrive at alone. And then I think also as a wise person, Dr. William Howard, who at the time was the first African-American president of New York Theological Seminary, said to me, think about how you got to know what you know and work backward to teach it to somebody else, and that will do a lasting good in the world. Finally, read widely, be aware of what you read.
Yes.
Choose sources that don't always agree with everything you believe to be true, so that you challenge yourself to fill in any gaps in your own understanding. Refine your opinion, and then share it with someone else and invite that person's honest feedback. Then together with that consensus, brainstorm together, what can we do to do good?
And Mike, we're down to our last 4 minutes, and I have 2 questions for you, and I'm going to ask you those 2 questions at the same time. The first one is, where do you go? Well, let me ask that question differently. One, what is your favorite place in Harlem? The second one is, when you want to unwind, what do you do?
With regard to the first question, Sylvia's is an obvious answer. We were there with our students to celebrate and culminate our project. And what struck me, was the wonderful meal we all had. And and these are kids who don't always eat breakfast. They're running late to get to school. They try to furtively snack on chips sometimes as classes ensue. And then at lunchtime, the vicissitudes of the quality of the school lunch may or may not be an issue. So to enjoy and share together a wonderful meal at Sylvia's is something I and we will never forget. But moreover, to see and to be able to identify for the students the autographed photographs that line the walls, including one they noticed of Reverend Sharpton sitting with President Obama, I think was a priceless, unexpected pleasure, because it helped say to students that they were indeed part of a long tradition of working for justice. So often in the age of cell phones and electronic devices and social media, it seems for many young people that it's all or nothing right now. And in fact, you and we know that time continuums exist, and that's yet another lesson we need to equip our young people with to their own empowerment.
That's great, and I know they loved it, and what a great experience. So how do you, Mike, we're down to our last 2 minutes, I think. How do you unwind with all the work that you're doing and have some downtime for you, family, kids? What do you do?
Well, less with the kids than I used to, because they're both on their own. In addition to Sam being at Penn State at age 20, Katie has gone back to school at 26 after some extensive traveling, including volunteering at a social justice conference in Switzerland. Now she's a junior at Evergreen State College outside Seattle. But my wife and I enjoy reading. Saturday is my favorite day of the week, because that's the one day where I vow to do no school work. And we enjoy walking around the Prospect Park parade grounds in almost any weather, but especially if it's a sunsplash day and we get to watch the Caribbean soccer players, the child soccer players, the baseball practicers, the tennis ball whackers, and watch out for the bike riders and dog runners and so on. And that just takes us into a different world. And and then I really enjoy reading history for recreation. Recently I finished the 1863 volume of Carl Sandburg's work on Lincoln, and that was the volume where the decision is taken to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Which is undervalued by many people today, because Lincoln followed through on it to then successfully achieve a forever ban on slavery in the entire United States and all of its future territories, something for which I think he's not gotten the credit he deserves. And that same reading taught me there's always more to the story, which acquainted me with the indispensable role that Frederick Douglass played.
Well, Mike, it's perfect timing, because we've got a little change left on the show, and I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. It's always great speaking to you. We've got to do this again. Thank you, Mike, for being on the show, and I know you'll talk and we'll talk soon.
Yes. Danny, thank you. I was honored to speak with you and through you to your many listeners.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Take care.
Bye, Danny.
Bye-bye.